Thanks. As I was saying, well, I want to welcome Greg's book as an important addition to what, alas, a small shelf of recent books. Well, on the other shelf are all of the attacks on religion, which have been blockbusters. You know, 2 million copies of Richard Dawkins' Halavai. And then on our shelf, it's the shelf that Peter Steinfels in the New York Times calls the new atheists. And what makes us new atheists? It's that we're not concerned about attacking religion. We're concerned about answering important life questions. Or actually, I wish on you the review of my book that appeared recently in Jewish Currents, which talks about this is a book that answers religious questions. You know what I mean? That is to say, questions about meaning and purpose of life. And that's what Greg and I are both preoccupied with. Now, the problem, particularly among Americans, and now the interesting question here is to what extent Canadians also experience this, but certainly Americans live as if in a cloud in terms of seeing our way to meaning and purpose with clarity. And that cloud is the ideology that forms part of our, I don't want to say individual, because we also have the Jewish DNA, but the American DNA of isolated individualism. We are all on our own, right? And we all make our lives by ourselves, right? And if we succeed, then we get all credit. And if we fail, we get all blame. And there's something strange, perverse, abstract, and distorting about that ideology. And I like to think that our Canadian friends don't have it as fiercely. I think that's right. I think in the United States, for example, the battle over national health insurance is an interesting one when you hear people with outrage not want to give what they've earned to other people who haven't earned it. It's a bizarre way of thinking, since what they've earned has usually come as the result of struggles of other people and of larger forces beyond themselves, of communities to which they belong. And oops, lo and behold, there I am in the sense of community. Because it's that sense of community that we are trained as Americans to not quite see, to not understand. I like to think that part of what makes religion so vital in the United States and so much a dominant feature of American life is precisely the absence of other forms of community and the mystification that Americans have about belonging to other communities, local, state, national, and world communities. In my Living Without God, I talk about that sense of community from a certain angle under the theme of gratitude, the kind of gratitude that any of us taking a hike on a summer, fall, winter, spring day, the gratitude we might feel in nature when we experience the sun on our face, when we hear birds chirping, when we come down a hill on a hike and see a lake in front of us. The gratitude that as non-believers, we try to get out of our head because, after all, we don't believe in God. So why should we feel grateful to some force beyond ourselves? And my answer, of course, is that we should. We should because we are not alone and isolated in this world. We have layers and layers of belonging. Belonging to nature, the nature that makes us possible. Belonging to all of evolutionary history. Belonging to human history. Belonging to global, national, and local societies, communities. All of those forms of belongings, we could either, because we're Americans and have a hard time seeing our way through to and understanding them, we could sort of mystify and chalk up to God, or not see at all. Or we could try to undo that ideological formation, or say deformation, and actually see how we are connected. Not spiritualistically, but realistically, materially, physically connected to all sorts of forces, communities, beings, histories upon which we depend. Because we are indeed, contrary to what we are raised to believe, fundamentally dependent beings, and our well-being is totally tied up with the well-being of the forces and communities on which we depend. And we mystify ourselves if we don't see it. If we do see that, if we recognize all of our layers of belonging, we can take a further step. The further step away, and I realize in working out some of these ideas, there was always a tendency in my mind, there's always been a tendency to criticize spiritualists because of their vagueness and fuzziness. Now, there are many spiritualists here, I'm sure. And my point, I've slowly educated myself to see, is not that spiritualists are wrong, but they're on to something, just as religious believers are on to something when they see themselves as dependent on forces beyond their control. My only point is that you can name these forces. You can see them, you can understand them philosophically, historically, sociologically, biologically. You can see and name these forces, and you can educate yourself to what these forces are. We can map our dependence. And the more you do it, the closer you come to some of the great writings of, not spiritualist writers necessarily, but I'm thinking of Charles Darwin, explaining how natural beings struggle for survival in the context of a world in which they are not only in conflict, he emphasizes that, but he also says interdependent. So it's a matter, what I like to stress is seeing this interdependence. Now, all of us have heard of, and some of us have even read, Albert Camus' notions of absurdity. The world is an absurd and meaningless place. It's impossible to comprehend. I'm an isolated individual. It makes no sense, and life, therefore, which we're fated to do, entails us pushing a rock up a hill, only to have it roll down again, and then we start over. That's the myth of Sisyphus. That's one vision of living without God. And I'm presenting a very different one, and the very different one entails communities because of our very genuine connections, which I stress Camus did not see. Although he did not see intellectually, although being not only a great writer, but a great individual, he lived the connections without being willing to discuss them in his writing. Now, some of you have, this is sort of, so far doing a 5-minute snapshot of a talk that some of you have heard at greater length, and I know Miriam has heard 3 times. And I'm really happy to only have to give a 5-minute snapshot, because what I really want to connect it with is a section of my thinking and writing that I haven't had a chance to talk about, which I consider more important, but I've been very shy about. And when Greg says there are no do-overs, it sort of forces me to pull that out of the back of my thinking and bring it forward, namely, living without God and the meaning of life without God can only be fully appreciated in the context of dying without God. One of the reasons I haven't talked about it much is it's a heavy topic, and it's difficult. But bear with me, because dying without God is, of course, our response to the trump card of religious believers. The trump card, which, if we've ever had a discussion, leads us to face the question, well, what's going to happen when you die? Because I know what's going to happen when I die, or something like that. And it's not simply burning in hell, it's also the fear of dying alone. In thinking about it, I realized that there is no answer to death. That's sort of the starting point. There is no answer. It is the ultimate and final fact. We're stuck with it. And what we have to do is, as Becker said, avoid the denial of death. The denial of death is built into not only not necessarily our psyche, but certainly our culture. One way to avoid the denial of death is to rest with Epicurus for a few minutes. Epicurus, who said, after all, when we're there, it's nothing. Death is nothing. And after we die, our atoms disperse. There's nothing more, nothing left. So our great fear, and he was arguing against the fear of death, our great fear can be combated with a sense that this is not hell, this is not punishment, this is not horror. There may be pain associated with dying, but then it's nothing. That was his effort to undo denial, especially the kind of denial he felt was installed in all religions. Now, but what happens if you follow Becker and you face death squarely? Is it possible to do that? Becker felt there was no answer. And in the end, those who read that famous book, Denial of Death, cover to cover, you're actually going to be very disappointed, because it begins in a very exciting, bracing way. Oh, yes, someone is finally talking about this issue. And he ends by embracing a heroic posture that is religious, if nothing else. And in the end, one feels, and he wrote this book as he was dying as a relatively young man, dying from cancer, one feels that he exposes denial and perhaps succumbs to it. But what if you don't embrace a heroic posture in the face of dying, and you don't embrace religion? Well, you understand, among other things, that death conditions everything in a very strange way. Every building is a structure protecting humans against the elements. Follow out what that means. Every food transport among other things, is protecting us against death, is a way of combating death. And as you think in these terms, you can see how much of our civilized life activity, how much of everyone's life activity from the beginning of time is about combating death, about surviving. It is the ultimate reason, that combat, for so much of what we do, so much of what we make. Now, where does that take us, though? Well, one of the things it does is suggest to us that we have to feel again and again our own fears. Our own fears, which don't just, it would be nice if this would be a one-time only fear, that at a certain point in life, you're terrified of death and dying. You work it through with your psychotherapist, and it's over. You don't have to worry about it anymore. Well, I don't know. I don't think it happens that way. I think because it's about life. It's about the end of life. It's about loss. It's about loss of those we love. It's about mourning. It's about fear. It's also about, am I living enough? Am I living well enough? Am I fulfilling myself? Am I satisfied? It's not just about dying. It's about living. And the question must recur again and again and again. And it's annoying, we know. It's annoying to keep feeling things that are painful. It's worse than annoying. We protect ourselves against it. We don't want to keep feeling things that are painful. Rather than citing any of my favorite psychotherapists, psychoanalysts in the literature, I'd rather turn to Friedrich Nietzsche, who talks about the importance of feeling what is most painful in life in order to feel alive. He was in touch with, in advance of Robert J. Lifton, the phenomenon of psychic numbing. He was in touch with the fact that we tend to anesthetize ourselves to what is most painful. But what happens when we anesthetize ourselves? Well, this is interesting. We have an interesting terminology for it. I feel dead. I feel deadened. Or I experience some strong feeling and I feel alive again. And the dead alive language is a language of our emotions, because we can, and we know it, we can be living dead. Not completely, of course, but we can anesthetize ourselves to that part of life which is painful to us and continue living and acting with that pain repressed, and repress other vital parts of ourselves. That's what Nietzsche was talking about. Feel alive, live fully. Nietzsche says, this doesn't sound like Nietzsche at all, say yes to life. Sounds like a commercial for a drink. But sounds like Rick Warren, yes, say yes to life. But Nietzsche's saying it without God hovering behind. Nietzsche's saying it knowing he's going to die. And that Camus understood that as well, brilliantly. Having criticized him, I want to say he understood brilliantly that it's by understanding that life ends, giving up the fantasy and practice of living for a life beyond this life. It's in doing that that one is able to experience the moment one senses one's existence in nature most feelingly and fully. And I would just suggest read any of Camus' novels, and you have a writer who was not only saying that theoretically, but in whose writing style nature and the body come alive. He had the sense of that intense energy that comes when you say, this is all there is. There's nothing more. Because as long as we hesitate and try to invent something beyond, then we're removing the power and force and excitement and enthusiasm and awe from what we experience. So this leads to a notion of living fully, intensely. Not manically, but with a sense of not hiding out from life. And I would suggest it also entails taking chances, not anesthetizing or being incredibly safe about things that we do. Okay, look, everybody here is a thinking adult and has thought through a lot of these things. And so I'm not saying a whole lot that's very new. Still, if we do this, if we live fully without God, with a sense of death as the frame of our life, we have to face the other side. That is to say, as we age, there is a diminishment of our life. There is aging. Whoever didn't wake up this morning with some thing you needed to stretch out or sort of pay attention to because of an ache or because it wasn't quite, the night wasn't quite sound sleeping as it should have been, hasn't reached that point yet. Hasn't reached that point yet. But a lot of us have. It's that point of diminishment, and here there is I have a favorite couple of writers about this. One is Simone de Beauvoir, whose book, The Coming of Age, was mistitled. It really is Old Age. Coming of Age makes it sound marvelous. But the book is about diminishing. And it's a painful book because she's especially preoccupied with diminishing. And she says, as we age, we lose the one thing that makes our life worthwhile, which is our practical activity in the world. And she's right. We do it less and less and less. And then there's nothing left, she says, and then we die, except for a tiny handful of people. She wasn't paying attention to the philosophy of her lifelong companion, Jean-Paul Sartre, because his philosophy talks about, and this is the extrapolation of all of his works that I've studied, his philosophy talks about no matter how much the space diminishes, which it does, as long as we are alive, functionally alive, there still is some space. And that some space gives us the task of our age, our old age, our older old age. That gives us our activities and our tasks. And the space may be less and less physical mobility. The space may be less and less energy. But that freedom for which Sartre was so famous does not get taken away until we lose our faculties completely, which he does not regard as even worth considering. That is to say, until we die. As long as we have faculties left, we have space, we have activity, we have meaningful life. And as I say, Beauvoir refused to pay attention to that. Sartre lived it. And that's an interesting, I won't go into it, how he lived it. It was very controversial. She hated how he lived it. But indeed, he did live it. So that takes us, in this very quick discussion of some of the aspects of dying without God, that does take us to some thoughts. Living as fully as possible, facing death, feeling the pain, finding the space and being as active as we can within that space. That space could include, for example, such activities as grandparenting, which is, as those of you who have been involved in it, one of the great blessings and joys of life. But then, despite everything, we die. If we've lived well, we die. If we've aged out well, we die. If we've been fortunate and managed to avoid totally debilitating illnesses, we die. If we survive, we lose those we've loved. Even Mr. Playboy, Hugh Hefner, this morning's New York Times, talks about aging at 83 being richer and happier than anyone knows. He's going to die. In the end, there's no way out. In the end, there's no way out. And I don't think, you remember The Seventh Seal by Bergman, and you remember the knight chasing around for the answer to death. And the only answer to death seemed to be young Joseph and Mary with their baby. The knight was checkmated by death. I don't know if you felt that that was a good enough answer. It wasn't for Bergman, because he kept making ever more depressing films. But in the end, we lose consciousness, we're gone. And without talking about hope in the largest way, hope for the world, hope for society, hope for humanity, I want to ask the question, after we're gone, what is left of us? And now I get to read one of my favorite passages in the book for the first time. And after we're gone, what is left of us? When philosopher Jacques Derrida was interviewed during the last days of his life, he spoke about survival. Whatever remains after our death of our life, activity, and contributions. Robert J. Lifton develops a more systematic analysis of ways in which we seek symbolic immortality. However we describe it, after we are dead, the fact is that we will, quote unquote, live on in ways large and small. And in writing this chapter, in writing the book, and in the talk I've just given, I show some large ways people live on. I mentioned Beauvoir, Sartre, Camus, Lifton. I'm talking about Epicurus, Becker, people whose writings I've returned to in my lifetime, and who matter, who continue to matter long after they're dead. Something of these people survives into the present. Okay, but that's not us. If we're not writers of books, or we're not writers of great and successful books, or we're not people whose influence we're accustomed to notice, what about ordinary people? Ourselves. It's worth taking time to reflect on how, in large ways and small, in attitudes, actions, and decisions of those who came before us and those who continue to live around us, our parents and people of an earlier generation continue to affect us and continue at this very moment to make us who we are. After all, as secular and humanistic Jews, we have a deep awareness of our history. And that history needs to include our families, and needs to include our families and people who have loved us in very specific ways. A major role in my life and identity was played by people I didn't even know, grandparents I never knew, a forgotten grandmother who died when I was 3, and step-grandparents whose love I remember. Most of them left me fragments to go on, from old photographs and stories that recall them, glints of pride, moments of conviction, acts of freedom, and specific decisions of mine, all of which continue to affect me today, 2 generations later. What about me? What about us? I'll continue to have my effect into the future. We all will. Houses we've built and bought and lived in survive us. Trees we've planted survive us. Public edifices built with our tax money survive us. The contributions of our work lives survive us. People we've given ourselves to and our children survive us. Just as our grandparents and parents remain with us for our entire lives, so may something of us remain with our loved ones far into the future. And we should think about it. We should take account of it. It can be mapped. I don't mean simply being remembered. My grandson won't recall those many nights during his first 6 months when I calmed his colic by dancing with him until he fell asleep. His father was away in military service because of the war in Iraq. And he had special need of his grandfather's love, and it became part of him. Today, he's forgotten it. But I know it's there, and I know it's part of him. Many of the most important effects people have upon each other enter unconsciously into their personalities and characters, indeed, into their bearing and posture and ways of moving through life, becoming absorbed into who they are. My daughter demonstrates this in an essay she wrote. She points out how, in the case of feminism, the results of social struggles become absorbed into the identities of those who come afterward. These struggles and their victories continue to be lived even when the subsequent generations are without any awareness of the ideas and movements that originally generated their own attitudes and prospects. Most people don't pay attention to vital facts like these, but they're vital. So, to the extent to which I can stand here and say this morning, I have to thank a whole lot of people. And I specifically had in mind when I wrote this, the genial morning classical music hosts of Detroit radio station WRCJ-FM, who live on in this book, for their delightful conversation and soothing programming as I wrote this during the summer of 2007 when I was undergoing treatment for prostate cancer. I make these acknowledgments part of the talk. The acknowledgments shouldn't come after. They're part of life itself. And there could be many others, because they show that we all live on in others in elemental ways, through our disposition, our example, our caring, our sense of humor, our way of solving problems, as well as through our conscious and deliberate contributions. We live on through the memory of special moments in which we were present. And we live on through being a grain of sand in the vast social movements that we lived through and in which we participated. What we've done and who we've been remains part of the wider universe long after we're gone. This is only one of many things we might hope to affirm in the face of death. Thank you.